Good morning, everyone. This meeting is being recorded and will be on SyscoFoodie.com either later today or later this week. So if you didn't catch it all or you can't catch it all, be sure to look at that. I'm Dawn Fitzgerald, representing Sysco. Today we have Howard Berkower with us. He's a partner at McCarter English. Our speaker today is a trusted corporate advisor to businesses of all types and sizes, from startups to seasoned companies. Howard makes his clients' goals his top priority. He tailors a desired result for each individual client, including private companies, public companies, private equity funds, and buyout funds, venture capital funds, and the list goes on and on. Howard provides his clients with a full range of corporate transactional legal services, from initial planning stages, negotiation, and drafting of legal documents to deal conclusions keyed to the organization's strategic and financial goals. Recent transactions have included venture capital investments ranging in size from $5 million to $25 million, the sale of a portfolio of companies for over $100 million, and the formation of private equity funds. We are very, very fortunate to have Howard here to speak to us on the Restaurant Revitalization Fund. So with that, I'll turn it over to Howard. Thank you, Howard, for joining us.
You're very welcome, Dawn, and thank you for that very nice introduction. I guess one thing that is missing from that is I'm a big foodie, and I always say that I'm on the other side of this business from probably most of the people listening here who basically run restaurants and other types of businesses, and I consider myself among your best customers. I love to eat and love to support restaurants, and I'm very, very honored to be here to talk about a new program that just came into being last month that involves outright grants being given by the Small Business Administration. Unfortunately, has yet to kick off. It's expected to do so sometime this month, perhaps in the next week. But basically, in connection with the most recent passing of the 1.5 trillion stimulus package, there has been made available $28.6 billion, principally for restaurants, such as most of the people, most of the businesses, I assume, listening in on this presentation. If we could go to the next slide, I wanted to just point out to you, I think that's a hyperlink, and I apologize in advance because technology and myself, it's like I'm allergic to that. So I often have difficulty with technology, but on the introduction page, there's a hyperlink, hopefully that it works, to the actual section in the statute, in the rescue package, which goes on for the statute itself is countless pages. I want to say like thousands, but there's about a 10-page provision that basically has, sort of in a nutshell, the key provisions of this revitalization fund made available for restaurants and bars and other eating institutions, in case you have an interest to drill down and see that. But in the next slide, we sort of try to cover, in the next few slides, who qualifies for the grant and some of the ins and outs of the requirements and how it's supposed to work once it gets underway. So in connection with that, one must be an eligible entity, and that is basically any restaurant, food stand, food truck or cart, saloon, inn, tavern, brew pub, tasting room, tap room, or basically the catch-all, any licensed facility or premises where an alcohol producer, where the public may taste or sample products, or any similar place or business in which the public or patrons assemble for the primary purpose of being served food and drink. And that's what we define as an eating establishment. So you need to be an eating establishment, and you also need to have incurred what's called a pandemic-related revenue loss, which sounds, like it's going to be very complicated, but it is really not. It just means that from the period when COVID-19 sort of began through the end of this year, 2021, there was what's called a pandemic-related revenue loss. And on the next slide, give the definition of exactly what that is. And it's really quite simple, because for most cases, all it is the amount by which your calendar 2019 revenues was greater than your revenue receipts in calendar 2020, during which there was at least 9.5 months or so of interrupted pandemic impact, particularly to eating establishments. And so basically, it's a very simple calculation, can be taken from your tax returns. And even if you were, for some reason, if you were not in operation for the entire period of 2019, basically you get the revenue losses equal to the annualized average monthly gross receipts from 2019 compared to that of 2020. And if you basically didn't operate until during 2019, but opened up sometime in 2020, and you suffered, you basically presumably suffered losses, but since there's no sort of comparison with which to compare to a prior year, it's basically your payroll costs, which many of you will be familiar with because it tracks the Paycheck Protection Program definition of payroll costs. And last but not least, pandemic-related revenue loss is also deemed to include if you are a new eating establishment, which is not yet in operation on the date that you apply for the grant, and indeed the grant applications are not yet available. To the extent that you've incurred eligible expenses, then you can basically get that as being deemed to be your pandemic-related revenue loss. And in addition, the statute also provides the SBA with an ability to change this formula, to change this provision, or to add a formula so that a restaurant can choose between which one gives it a larger number. Having said that, I have not heard any sort of scuttlebutt about whether or not a formula will be proposed by the SBA in this regard. So I think that it's pretty clear that it's easy, I would say, to qualify to be what the statute calls an eligible entity. That is basically a restaurant or an eating establishment, and also having incurred a pandemic-related loss. The next page outlines a few exclusions. So if we can turn to the next slide, we can see that there is a number of entities that are excluded, and some of them also you'll be familiar with to the extent that you've dealt with Paycheck Protection Program. So there is an exclusion if you've operated more than 20 locations. And also it includes your affiliated businesses. And this is sort of one area when we were reviewing the definitions that are directly in the statute where we think that there has to be more guidance provided by the SBA when this becomes an operative, because the way that they described affiliated business, it can be read to exclude basically going to a controlling entity. That is to say, it might not include parents of an eating establishment or entities under common control with an eating establishment. I don't think that was the intent, but it seemed to me to be perhaps something that in the statute wasn't clear, but I assume at the end of the day that these affiliated business definitions are very much going to work, at least at the 50% level, the way you are familiar with the Paycheck Protection Program. Also, another entity that will be excluded is if you have applied for or received a grant under the venue operators grant program, which I believe is supposed to become live today, but that's primarily for company, or basically for live venues that put on concerts and movies. And we can talk more about that program, because it's, in this case, it's very much either or, to the extent that you may be able to qualify for either, which I guess can be technically possible based on the definitions. You have to make a choice, and I think there are some things to keep in mind with respect to making the choice, although I suspect that many of the people on this call would more likely not qualify for a venue grant in connection with, because I don't know whether and the extent to which there are venues that put on live performances as a primary purpose of its activities of the eating establishment. Also excluded is our public traded company, which again gets to the point that I was sort of mentioning regarding the definition of affiliates and or state or local government operated businesses. So in my mind, when I think about this, I think it's somewhat easy for a restaurant or primarily eating establishment to qualify for this grant. And I want to be clear that unlike the Paycheck Protection Program, where you get a loan where if you use it in a certain way, it effectively becomes a grant, this is quite the opposite. It is a grant, it is an outright tax-free grant. And it's also funded directly by the SBA, which is the opposite of how the PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program, works, where the initial funding is basically provided by banks and other financial institutions that participate in the Paycheck Protection Program. So this is basically funds, once once a grant is issued, the government basically writes you a check directly, as opposed to getting the proceeds first from your local bank, and then if and to the extent that ultimately there's a default on it, that the bank then puts that loan to the SBA. So these are funds that are literally being sent by the SBA to qualified eligible entities, restaurants and similar eating establishments that have incurred a pandemic loss. In terms of the calculation of the grant, the next slide basically sets forth some of them. Yes.
There is one question about the exclusions or who's eligible. What about fraternal organizations?
I think the answer, I would assume that so long as it is primarily, I guess the issue with fraternal organizations is that whether or not it's a place of business in which the public or patrons assemble for the primary purpose of being served food and drink. So I think with the fraternal organization, I think it might depend on the specific facts as to what other things the fraternal organization engages in, and the extent to which you might be able to hive off those operations to the extent that they're not involved with serving patrons to come to eat and drink. So I hate to answer that question without more facts. The other thing to do, and this I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but I'll do it anyway, is unlike the Paycheck Protection Program where you're applying to a bank, and the bank may be reluctant to have an application be processed without SBA guidance. This is basically a application that you would send directly to the SBA. So depending upon the facts and circumstances of the fraternal order, and my sense would be if there's a way to the extent that it has other operations, if there might be a way to hive off or only count or use the grant in connection with the food and drink, you might basically send in an application and give a descriptive sort of analysis in terms of putting them on notice, if you will, about the specifics of your situation. But I think it would depend on the facts and circumstances. And I see this, and this actually gets into some of the live venue definitions, but it's potentially problematic depending upon the exact activities that the fraternal order conducts.
And Howard, if I opened a restaurant or bar around 2020, would I qualify for the grant? Or would someone qualify? Yeah.
That's the beautiful thing about this program, certainly, and I apologize. I didn't want to get into some of the differences between the venue operators grant program, but yes, you can demonstrate that so long as if you open the business after 2019, so that you don't have the ability to calculate a specific pandemic related loss, you can, if you start your business in January 2020, you can get your payroll costs covered for as demonstrating your pandemic related revenue loss. And even if you're not in operation yet, you can still get any eligible expenses that you've incurred. So the beauty of this program is that even if you basically don't have year-to-year figures, if you will, you can still get an outright grant if you opened in 2020 based on your payroll costs, or if you haven't even opened yet, as you plan to, as you prepare to open, you can get eligible expenses, things that are permitted to be used with, the proceeds of the grant can be used for. You can get a grant and use it for those purposes, basically to repay you, if you will, or to fund those related eligible expenses.
That's very interesting.
Yes, I think that's one of the things, as I've said before, is I think in many instances, and maybe this is a subject we'll cover in more detail, this program is to me, on its face, seems better than the live venue grant program. I just wanted to point out that as regards to the grant calculation, they will reduce the amount of the grant by any PPP loans that you may have received. This includes both first or second draw. And I think the logic behind that is it's designed to repay you, basically to cover your pandemic related losses. So to the extent that the PPP loans were made available during that time, they've already helped to defray some of those existing costs. So they will be deducted. And the amount of the grant can't exceed 5 million per location or 10 million in the aggregate. And in those calculations, they'll look at affiliated businesses, which I think that there's an issue that, as I said before, that the SBA will need to provide further information on and clarification. The grant uses, that is what you can use these funds for, include a whole litany of things that are very similar to what we've seen before in the Paycheck Protection Program. So they can cover payroll costs, principal and interest on mortgage obligations, as disclosed in the next slide, rent payments, utilities, maintenance expenses, construction to accommodate outdoor seatings and walls, floors, decks, surfaces, fixtures, and equipment, supplies, including PPE, cleaning materials, food and beverage expenses that are incurred within the normal scope of business during the covered period. So that basically they don't want you to use your grant proceeds. I'm trying to think of an example. If you're a pizza shop and you normally buy your pizza boxes on a certain basis, they don't want you to then buy 5 years of pizza boxes with the proceeds of the grant. But so long as you're buying pizza boxes that you need in terms of consistent with your regular operating procedure, then it will certainly be covered. Covered supplier costs, which is a new cost expense that's covered on the new PP program, operational expenses, paid sick leaves, and then it is a catch-all for the SBA to allow you to use those funds for other purposes. And the way I sort of see this is grant proceeds can be used basically to keep your business operating and running in the ordinary course of business, and to the extent that they're sort of pandemic related as regards to heaters that may be used, or other outdoor seatings and things like that that are directly pandemic related. And the next slide basically sets forth priorities. I know that there's been a lot of controversy, particularly with the Paycheck Protection Program, as regards to how funds were initially made available, and a lot of cases got to the bank's best customers that were able to satisfy the requirements of being a small business, but might not have necessarily needed the funding because they were preferred clients of banks. And I know banks have said that they were very easy to process because they already knew them in terms of their requirements to know their client. But in most of the programs, there are lending priorities, and so that this grant program is no exception. So there are going to be priority given to businesses owned by women and veterans, to businesses in socially disadvantaged areas, and also they're trying to really target small businesses by giving those businesses with gross receipts of $500,000 or less sort of first dibs, if you will, until May 10th. May 10th, that's in the statute. It remains to be seen how quickly this grant program will be implemented, and whether or not those dates may slide. The next slide briefly covers.
Howard, one question on eligibility. Are nonprofits eligible for the grant?
That's an excellent question. So I would think, and I think that we need to, I can't answer that definitively, but I think that if a nonprofit, there's no requirement that the business be a small business, which has meaning under the SBA statute. So the fact that you're a nonprofit in and of itself does not mean you're disqualified. The issue is the extent to which you can establish that that people assemble at the business for the primary purpose of being served food and drink. and I'm not sure the specific nonprofit, if there's some way, again, where either the nonprofit is primarily, and I'm not exactly sure what the facts might be, that people go there for the primary purpose of eating. And to the extent that the nonprofit does other things, it remains to be seen whether the SBA, in providing guidance, will address that issue, as to, to the extent that the nonprofit has specific operations that are devoted solely towards serving food and drink, and if somehow that would enable the nonprofit to get the grant to be used directly in connection with its operations, in terms of providing an eating establishment.
They didn't provide a lot of detail, Howard, but I could see, like, what if it was a nonprofit that served food to the homeless or something like that?
So, and I think the inherent problem with that, to be honest, is I'm not sure how there's a pandemic loss in terms of revenue, because basically they're taking, they're taking contributions from, getting funding either from the state or the federal government, and they're using that funding to feed for free, presumably, the homeless. So I'm not, it's not clear to me that this neatly fits into the specific purpose of this restaurant fund, revitalization fund. But it's a very good, it's a good question, and there are also places where I know that there are different kinds of like nonprofit where the part of what's involved is putting on a program, but it's also providing food, and this again goes into the venue program, the grant program, that I briefly mentioned. I think, again, I don't want to state definitively. I think it would be a hard stretch, the example that you provided, but it remains to be seen.
Another question that came up, Howard, with all the businesses, there's catering business companies or businesses that would go into these commercial buildings with a cart and go to office to sell the food or lunch. And now, these large commercial buildings won't allow them to come in the business, and they have to be outdoors. So so it's impacted their business. Would that be covered?
Yeah, I think it would. I think under food truck, food cart. I think that basically, to my mind, that should qualify.
Gotcha. Okay. And then the other example, that the nonprofit is a lodge, and they've lost bar business and weddings is what it is, that they can't have the weddings there because of the large gathering restrictions, is what I would imagine.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I'm thinking on my, this is excellent. This is fun. I'm thinking on my feet. The only thing I have to go by is section 503 of the stimulus package, and my recollection of it is unclear. But that's a very good example of a situation that should apply. Like, it includes a saloon, inn, tavern, and a catering hall. To me, is the patrons are going there to be served and eat and drink and celebrate some occasion. That to me is very similar than if I take my family to a restaurant, to celebrate my daughter's graduation. It seems to me that it should qualify.
Perfect.
So I guess one of the things that I was just saying in the application, again, which isn't ready, but Hopefully it'll be posted at the SBA.gov site, which has a lot of good, has a sort of a hyperlink to COVID-19 resources and funding opportunities. You're required to provide a certificate in good faith that basically the pandemic, the uncertain current economic conditions make necessary the grant to support the ongoing operations of, you know, the eating establishment, and also to certify that you've not applied for or received a venue grant. It seems to me, and again, these are all very good examples, you know, in terms of catering hall and some of the nonprofits, so long as we stick to sort of like food carts, restaurants in terms of that, so long as you can demonstrate a pandemic loss, or that you were operating during, you know, if you didn't have operations in 2019, that you were operating in you know, during the pandemic, you can qualify for this grant, which I think is a really good thing, and I would hope would provide some very valuable targeted support to an industry that's been hurt perhaps more than most. Basically the grants will need to be returned, so the funding will be returned under a few limited situations. Those include where you fail to actually use the grant funds prior to the end of this year, 12/31/2021, or you go out of business before spending all the grant funds, or there's basically the pandemic-related revenue losses were estimated on the application, and the estimate greatly overstates what the losses were ultimately calculated to be. So I just want to, you know, point out a few things here that is somewhat different from the PPP. You know, PPP, generally speaking, if you've filed for bankruptcy, or you ultimately previously filed for bankruptcy, or there's all sorts of these limitations that, at least for the grant fund on its face, are not implicated, which should make it fairly user-friendly. And again, I think that our audience has you know, set forth in my mind a number of interesting questions regarding the extent to which and business is what's called I'm calling it an eating establishment. I think that's some of the more interesting questions in terms of providing relief to the industry, because I do think the intention certainly was to paint with a broad brush. They weren't just limiting it to restaurants. They weren't just limiting it to bars. They were trying to cover, you know, many ways in which an industry provides for the general public the ability to eat and drink. I saw a question come up regarding the grant funds returning, the requirement to return the grant funds, and it's only the money that you don't spend. So if you got a grant of $100,000 and by the end of the cover period you haven't used all of it, let's say you've used 90,000, the amount that you need to return would be the $10,000. Similarly, if you went out of business before spending all of the grant funds, to the extent that you spent funds on the purposes that set forth in terms of what they can be used for, you wouldn't have to return those funds. You'd only return the funds you haven't spent.
That's interesting, Howard. Another question that came up is, will we be able to use the same payroll cost used for the PPP loan forgiveness to also qualify as allowable expenses for this grant?
So I think that you have to segregate the uses. generally speaking, if you're using, and this applies across the board, you should be able to segregate. I've been advising clients to basically, to the extent that they intend to apply for other relief, whether it's an emergency, it's an EIDL loan, that they should segregate payroll costs, so long as they specifically identify the payroll costs that they're using it for. It should be fine. What you don't want to do is claim the same payroll costs twice. So I guess, and I'm just thinking out loud because it is a very good question. So this would apply when you have received, and let's just say, for argument's sake, you got a PPP second draw and you're using it, and at the same time you get one of these restaurant revitalization grants. I would make sure, because the way it's going to come up is when you seek loan forgiveness of your payroll costs. There could be the bank or the SBA, if they can find out that you've gotten both, will want to make sure that you didn't double dip. So that's why I think that it's best to segregate the costs that you're using you're using either the PPP for, from the pool of funds that you're using the grant for. And this way there will be no question that you're trying to benefit twice from basically one expense.
It's probably a good segue into the next slide, actually.
Okay, so there, and again, these are estimated timeframes, and I must say, this is all, and I guess this goes for the pandemic. It almost feels like, I guess the football analogy is everyone's getting to the line of scrimmage, and they think they're going to run a particular play, and this is the timing that it's going to be. But because of circumstances, they're constantly calling audibles at the line of scrimmage. But we expect, and I think that one of my colleagues was able to cull this information from the National Restaurant Association, which its lobbyists may have had conversations with the SBA about this, but that in this month, the SBA is going to basically give these grant applications, or basically the forms, and provide rules and guidance. So hopefully they'll answer some of the questions that were raised here today, because they're very, very good ones. And then there's going to be a initial period where preference is going to be given to small businesses owned by veterans and women and disadvantaged areas, and smaller enterprises, those with annual revenues of less than 500,000, and then basically opened up for everyone else. And hopefully they'll keep as close as possible to sort of the schedule, because it's, as I'm thinking, restaurant businesses and businesses particularly that enjoy robust business during the spring and summer months, relief couldn't come too soon. And so I hope that basically things pick up in terms of making these grants available to be applied for. I would suggest that while you're waiting, that you pull together information about your pandemic-related loss, whether it's sort of filing, making sure you've filed tax returns for calendar 2019 and 2020, or payroll costs, if you're basically a new business that didn't start in operation until 2020, or if you're a business that hasn't opened its doors for business yet, that you document eligible expenses, which are fairly broad, that you have either committed for and or may have already paid for, because they could be the basis of your grant amount. That basically concludes at least my presentation. Another thing I might mention, so as a lawyer, we look at grant programs separately and very differently from that of the SBA loan program. So generally speaking, grant programs require a certain process and procedure that, among other things, includes getting a reference number, a DUNS number, which is given out by Dun & Bradstreet and can be time-consuming and difficult to get. That is not going to be the case. We've learned within the last week or so, as regards to the restaurant relief. The Restaurant Revitalization Grant Program will not require that. The Shuttered Venue Operators Grant, what I call the SVOG, will or does. And I just point out a few differences, again, to the extent that you may, some of the participants may be able to qualify under both programs. So in the Shuttered Venue program, you basically get 45% of your 2019 gross revenue. And as compared to 100% of the difference of your revenue between 2019 and 2020. And unlike the Restaurant Revitalization Grant Program, in which we've covered before, you don't need to have been operating immediately before the pandemic breakout. In the Shuttered Venue Operators Grant Program, you do have to be in operation before the pandemic broke out. So those are a few. I think the principal difference in my mind, and again, thinking this through, would be that you can basically get the delta between your lost revenues from 2019 compared to 2020 as a grant, which I find very appealing. And presumably, I'm thinking it might be, although it depends, might be more than 45% of your 2019 gross earned revenue. So I think that in my mind, I would, right now, the only option one has is the Shuttered Venue Operators Grant. Although I say that it was supposed to start actually today, but I must confess, within an hour before this program started, the last time I checked the website, there's no application available. So, but to the extent that you think that you may qualify for both, you might want to consult with your accountant or sort of think through which program might be better, because this choice is either or, whereas with PPP, generally speaking, PPP may reduce the amount that you get, but it's not an either or thing. So I that would be my thinking.
Thank you, Howard. We have a couple questions. If a veteran or woman owns more than 30% of the company, would that give them preference?
That is a good question. The answer, I do not know, but I'd be happy if there's some way to get back to that.
If you give it to me, we have the person who asked the question, they registered.
Okay,
so we
I will
can
do that.
Reach out to her directly. Yeah.
Yeah. Very
and
good
then
question.
this other question is, our lease is up and our landlord is in foreclosure. If we relocate, can we still qualify for the grant?
The answer to that would be yes, because again, the only, I guess there's nothing prohibiting that business from qualifying for the grant. The issue would be, because the lease was up and you had to move, which expenses, whether you could, which expenses you could use as related to this new lease as a qualified grant use. And I mean, I would say, and again, I think that if we're talking lease, I would think that you have a very good argument that you were forced to leave to go from one place to another. So this isn't where you've renegotiated a mortgage, let's say. So I would think that, you know, again, I'm not the ultimate decider, but I would think that you would have a very good argument that your rent payments at the new place should qualify for a valid grant use, because if you didn't pay it, you'd have no place to do your business. Which brings up, if I could, another issue that we've been able to help a number of our clients with. We've experienced a number of, you know, I think a lot of this legislation, no matter how well thought out it is, didn't think through a lot of things. And you know, we've had issues with forgiveness applications, dealing with supplier costs, and a lot of restaurant, in this case, it was a restaurant where it was only, it basically distinguishes between like produce that will spoil, if you will, and supplies. I guess the example that I used of a pizza, pizza boxes at a pizza shop. So the way the rule works, you know, technically speaking, supplies that are non-perishable, you're supposed to be qualified for forgiveness only if there's an existing contract in place before the pandemic started. And our clients, actually this happened yesterday, I want to say. And so, you know, our advice on this is, you know, a contract can be an implied contract. And I think that what really they're after is they don't want you to front end load, in this case, it was PPP funds, to basically pay for things that don't deal with your continued operation. So the fact that if, as a matter of course, in this case, the pizza parlor typically orders their boxes, you know, a month's supply, or, you know, on a regular weekly basis, and they don't have a work, what is it called, like a work order, if you will, where they have additional purchase orders. You know, we said that you know, we would suggest that those costs be included in what's sought to be forgiven, even though you know, we could argue that it may not, the express language of the rule may not allow it. Contracts can be both written or implied by a course of conduct. And so there have been a number of questions that have come up. We've also had questions on PPP, on the second draw, which limit companies to qualify for the second draw if they have certain connections with China. We've come across instances where the bank institution that's basically the gatekeeper have been interpreting those provisions more broadly than is the way that it's been written, and also, you know, a plain meaning of it. So basically, you know, in that case, we had a client that was having difficulty getting a second draw. We were able to help because it had a small subsidiary operating in China, but it wasn't owned by a significant share. It had no shareholders other than U.S. individuals, and it had no member of its board that were resident of the mainland China. And those are the restrictions. So we were able to, you know, be helpful in those regards, because some of the issues that come up, it may be a matter of first impression, but you know, sometimes if we're able to work with the bank or speak with them, we can work through some of those issues. So some of these questions that are coming up, I think I'm hopeful as regards to this grant program, the Restaurant Revitalization Program, will have guidance from the SBA once they release their application and rules. But I do think that it makes sense for restaurants to sort of get ready to have those applications be filled out. And so to the extent that there are issues that they're sort of fronting, like this, the use of the grant for a new lease, I think that's good to get it out on the table so that they know the issues that may come up.
I agree, Howard. I know this next question because you and I worked on a toolkit that we will be providing everybody. We'll email it out to everyone that's on this call today, along with the recording. But is a SAM registration still required? And from the research I did, it is still required. Howard, keep me honest on that.
It required for?
To apply. That's what I saw when I was looking at SBA. It is required. You have to register.
In which loan program are we talking about? The Restaurant
Revitalization.
Well, that would be news to me. I know that you're not required to get a DUNS, a DUNS number. I wasn't sure if that meant they were going to use a process other than the SAM. Quite honestly, I thought that that they weren't going to be using the SAM gateway, but
we will clarify that and get back to the person about that. And then Howard did say he'll get back to us on, this, we talked about the 30%
yes.
women or veteran, but you'll get back to us on that because this next question is, what about a 50% women or veteran owned business? Do they qualify for that?
I think they should, but I will confirm. I was thinking, my thought, again, it would be a majority, but I could, we will drill down and I will get back to you, Dawn, on that.
Okay, yes, please.
Yep.
And then the next question is about 2 locations. They've always operated under one tax ID and one tax return. May we submit one RR application with combined sales and cost records?
That sounds fine, yes.
And what about franchise fees and franchise advertising? Do they qualify for RR expenses?
Gee, bear with me 1 second.
Mm-hmm.
Like this. I on first impression, I think it might be considered other operational expenses. If you're, assuming you otherwise apply and you're required to pay, franchise expenses to operate that, advertising is a traditional sort of operating expense. I think that it may very well.
And this other one is they received an email from SBA yesterday to increase their EIDL. If we get the increase, will that affect the grant, or can we get both?
Yes, I can get both.
And someone just confirmed that SAM is not required any longer.
Okay. So my thinking there is it's supposed to be the SBA's desire or their intent is to make this more simple. So I think that they have a sensitivity to moving quickly on providing the restaurant revitalization grants. Having said that, we haven't heard a whole lot from the SBA, and indeed the revitalization grant basically became law on March 11. So in fairness to them, it's been 3 or 4 weeks ago, but I think they are aware of the need, and there's an attempt on their part to make this easier to use, because we have a number of my colleagues deal with grant programs and dealing with, and they can be, I think that's one of the reasons why, in terms of rolling out Triple P, that they're using banks, because they may do it more efficiently than the SBA does. And I think that grant programs and just contracting with the government can be a very thorny and time-consuming endeavor, and which is fine in one sense if you're not in an emergency, but many of these programs are designed to address what clearly is an emergency, and in particular for our friends in restaurant and food service business.
And Howard, one of our operators just received an email about the shuttered venues grant that it opens at 11 today. That's different from this one, right?
Yes, we should talk because maybe, and I'd like to discuss with you, maybe we have a program about that. But
Okay.
that is a different program. It's a $15 billion program, primarily for like movie theaters and concert halls, and basically dealing primarily with entertainment. Basically, unlike the restaurant revitalization, which is principally designed for people to enjoy, meet other people and enjoy food and drink, the Shuttered Venue Operators Grant deals with principally when you go to see a show or a concert or a movie. And there are exceptions. There are blurry lines. Like a lot of times, I know I've enjoyed theater, which includes both a show and a meal. I know that the Shuttered Venue Operators Grant program has a FAQ that go into details as to the definitions of how to sort of segregate, to the extent that you can, businesses that have mixed use, so to speak. And we don't know to what extent, if at all, some of these provisions may be adopted by the SBA in connection with the launching of the Revitalization Fund for restaurants.
Well, we'll get your calendar, Howard, and see when we can schedule to talk about that one.
Okay.
We appreciate it. Well, Howard, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to all of the attendees for all the great questions. It was very informative. We hope you found it to be informative. Just a reminder that Sysco Concierge is here to help. All you have to do is submit a project request on our Restaurant Rising site, and we can help with guidance on what you can do to promote your business, social media, server training, help with menus, help with logo development. But we have a team that's there to help all. So just please reach out to us. You can call us on the 800 number. And then the next few sessions that we have coming up, we have restaurant reopening strategies on the 15th, and what you need to know again about the Restaurant Revitalization Fund. Howard will be back with us on April 22nd. Thank you again to everyone. Howard, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate you dedicating your time to this
my pleasure. And I think one of the thinking in terms of the scheduling is we're very hopeful that by April 22nd, we'll have a lot of answers to some of the very good questions that have been posed, and have more sort of meat on the bone as regards to the rollout and implementation of this grant program for restaurants and bars.
Well, we look forward to hearing about that.
Great.
Thank you, Howard. Thank you to everyone. We will get this presentation over to all of you, so be on the lookout for that, and have a great rest of your week.
Thank you. Stay safe.
You too.